Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. I'm Anushka Saxena, a research analyst with the Takshashila Institution's Indo-Pacific Studies program. And I'm joined by Mr. Vijay Gokhale, who is a non-resident senior fellow at Carnegie India and has formerly served as India's Foreign Secretary and Ambassador to Germany and China. Welcome, sir. Happy to have you in this conversation.
Thank you, Anushka.
Right. So today we're discussing an issue that's very close to my heart. And Mr. Gokhale, you've written a brilliant, very elaborate paper for Carnegie recently on this. What will the dynamics of a China-US-Taiwan crisis or conflict look like, and what implications they will have for Indian policy? The China-Taiwan or the PRC-ROC relationship continues to develop in a very dynamic fashion, with the action-reaction cycle that is caused by recent events across the Taiwan Straits demonstrating that further fraying of the relationship carries great threat for the world order and the regional order in the Asia-Pacific. Now, militarization of the Taiwan Strait is a continuous affair, with the US and China engaging in a lot of military muscle flexing. And as you also argued in your paper, Mr. Gokhale, the major reason this is the case is that Taiwan is a symbol of what it means to be a great power for both the US and China. But of course, we understand that for every successive Chinese leader since Mao, reunification with Taiwan forms a core tenet of what we know as the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And so for China, this is more than just about its great power status. It's also about historical red lines that cannot be negotiated. And it responds to any moves of cohesion and proximity between the US and Taiwan accordingly, sometimes even overreacting, as it did with the Pelosi visit last year and in a similar manner with Tsai Ing-wen's visit this last month. So as the situation in the Taiwan Straits continues to evolve and become more tense, Mr. Gokhale, my first question to you is, what should we understand by the term crisis in the Straits, in your opinion? So in the past, the first Taiwan Strait crisis involved an actual armed conflict between PRC and ROC forces, but that was when times were different and the US and the world recognized ROC as the sort of legitimate China. The second crisis was similar. It was a similar conflict and in similar times. And then by the time we come to the third Strait crisis in 1995-96, we essentially just see heavy missile testing by the PLA in response to the then Taiwanese President Lee Teng-hui visiting America. This is when the One China policy is the norm and the 1992 consensus is in place. So in that light, why can we or can we not, in your idea, refer to the PLA response to, say, the Pelosi visit or the Tsai visit as a fourth Strait crisis?
Anushka, I don't think we can refer to any particular event or incident as a crisis. A crisis, by its very definition, is a longer-term situation that prevails as a result of the actions of one or both parties. And therefore, it requires a prolonged period of time as well as actions and counteractions by both parties. I think it is important, however, to distinguish a crisis from conflict. Of course, whenever there is a conflict, it is inevitably a crisis as well. But it is not the case that there cannot be a crisis if there is no conflict. A crisis is anything which leads to general disruption of peace and stability and security in a region. And therefore, I would characterize a Taiwan Straits crisis as any situation, whether it is one involving conflict or not, but which involves a disruption in the general area of what we know as Taiwan.
Right. So, Mr. Gokhale, in your opinion, if a crisis is indeed different from a conflict, the context of your paper and the suggestions you make with regards to India drawing lessons from its response to Taiwan Straits crisis in the past, is that context relevant to the sort of peace and stability disruption that we saw during Pelosi's visit to Taipei or Tsai Ing-wen's visit to the US? Can we say that these are exactly the kind of disruptions to peace and stability in the general area or the region of Taiwan that India should also prepare for in the future? Or should we look at something more intense? Should we look at an actual armed conflict while shaping our policy, say, in areas such as disruption of supply chains, or the right time for us to intervene diplomatically between the US, China, and Taiwan?
Well, I think that the visit of Pelosi to Taiwan was an event which could trigger a crisis. But a crisis is more, as I said, than an event. A crisis is when a series of events lead to an escalation in the situation and when both parties begin to climb that escalatory ladder. Now, a crisis, of course, might end in a conflict, but our concern is to deal with a situation short of a conflict, but still disruptive enough to have an impact either on India's peace and security or on India's economy or both. And that sort of situation can be anything from a disruption of shipping in the Taiwan Straits to a disruption of the digital information flows between India and the Pacific, and to the extent of a possible quarantine or blockading of Taiwan. In each of these cases, all of which are short of actual conflict, the impact on India, either in terms of peace and security or in terms of the economy, can be substantial. So the objective of my paper was to identify possible responses that India could make in the event of such a situation transpiring in the Taiwan Straits. Now, I took the examples of the 1950s merely to make the point that although we had recognized that the People's Republic of China was the sole representative of the Chinese people even in 1949, that did not mean that we took a hands-off position on the Taiwan Straits crises that occurred in the 1950s. In fact, our position was the opposite. Our position was that where peace and tranquility and stability and security of the region is at stake, it is India's business and the business of other countries in the region to express concern and to take diplomatic action as well as other action as deemed fit to mitigate or resolve that crisis. And I think that lesson is very much applicable in the 2020s as well.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Mr. Gokhale. And I will come back to you on what are the possible economic disruptions that face India and the rest of the countries in the region, with Taiwan being put under a quarantine or a blockade, or, a massive effective aggression that the PLA may conduct in response to escalatory events that may eventually lead to a conflict. But before that, I'd like to follow up with you on how you talk about India drawing lessons from the 1950s. If we talk about India in the China-Taiwan US dynamic, there are several, but all equally contentious options available to India in the event of a crisis or conflict scenario between China and Taiwan, in my opinion. And so in your paper for Carnegie, you make an assessment that India should draw lessons from the 1950s and continue to observe the situation in East Asia, lest the US and China temporarily accommodate each other and China may feel more comfortable being aggressive at the Indian border. And you also cite the example of 1962, where you say that US's entrenchment with the Cuba issue and its guarantee to China that it will not support the government of the Republic of China in a conflict against PRC was ultimately, ultimate factor that kind of encouraged China to launch a war against India. But if you are to genuinely believe that a two-front challenge is one facing China as well, and that the US and China relations are at their worst in the current context, can we actually see the US accommodating China on the Taiwan issue and allowing it to then arm twist India and ultimately sort of eliminate India as one of its two prongs of threat perception? Is that actually possible in the current scenario?
Anushka, that's a hypothetical question that I cannot answer because I'm not aware of policy in Washington or in Beijing. The objective of using the examples of the 1950s were essentially to draw certain lessons for us in how we should act in future. And I think those lessons are relevant today. Firstly, that what happens in the Taiwan Straits becomes India's business when peace and security of the region is threatened and India's larger interests are impacted. Second, that in this situation where there is a crisis in the Taiwan Straits, we should be clear whether our actions are motivated by self interest or by what we believe to be morally right or ethically proper. These two are not necessarily in consonance and sometimes can be in conflict. And my point in the earlier crises of the 1950s was that India's desire to be correct and proper and moral in its actions, in fact, was in a certain way hampered our diplomatic ability to achieve our objectives. And the third point that I made, to which you allude, is that in the late 1950s, because the United States had a larger crisis to deal with, and as any major state, you eventually compromise in certain areas in order to fulfill national interests and others. They lost interest in the Taiwan Straits while they were dealing with the larger Soviet threat in Cuba. And China used this window of opportunity to deal with India because, in a sense, there was always the possibility China felt that if the Taiwan situation got heated, the United States and India might act in concert. Therefore, the lesson was that great powers very often reach compromises and that other countries must be conscious of this possibility and not rule it out. That was the limited objective of my taking those examples on the paper. As to whether that situation will prevail today, as to whether the United States and China will reach a compromise on Taiwan, and whether that will lead China to attempt some kind of military adventure with India, is purely speculative, and I have no basis to draw any firm conclusions on either of those hypotheses.
Right. Absolutely, Mr. Gokhale. And the kind of extensive archival material that you use in your paper to explain how, say, Krishna Menon's actions may have adversely impacted our diplomatic endeavors during the first and the second Taiwan Strait crisis are very telling about the moral posture that India chose to take at that point in time. But now, as we see the shifts in Indian foreign policy, and we also see our External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar reiterating that India is now a country with a foreign policy that is driven by national interest, by self-interest, by an alignment that is issue-based and not necessarily moral or ethical. Do you see perhaps India overcoming that need to be proper and actually taking tough stance in case of a crisis situation between China and Taiwan? And if so, what are the kind of diplomatic responses that you see emerging from the Indian political community? And would you say that depends on whether the crisis kind of eliminates in a conflict, or would you say that the Indian side would urge that the status quo be maintained indefinitely, or would you say that India now even has incentive to go as far as to convince Taiwan to take steps towards independence? So in this scenario building kind of light, do you see that India can now take a harsher, more proactive foreign policy and diplomatic approach towards maintaining peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait? And does it have incentive to do so now that it may not have had perhaps in the past, now that its relations with China are also souring on the border?
I would agree with you to the point that Indian foreign policy has become more pragmatic and practical, and therefore we are unlikely to act simply on the basis of what is morally or ethically correct. Although I do believe that Indian foreign policy is still a principled foreign policy and is not completely pragmatic to the point where we discard principles and values. Nonetheless, Indian foreign policy has shown its capacity to adapt in a realistic manner to challenges, and I have no doubt that going ahead, that capacity will be enhanced as India's economy grows and as our comprehensive national power also expands. That having been said, it is very difficult to predict what policy India might adopt in any future Taiwan Straits crisis. But I think the point of my paper was that if there is any action to be taken or undertaken by India in any form or in any manner, that has to be taken prior to the crisis actually becoming a crisis. Because once that happens, India does not have the military or economic capability, or even for that matter of fact, the diplomatic bandwidth to fundamentally influence either of the two major players in this crisis, and that is the People's Republic of China on the one hand and the United States of America on the other. Therefore, any diplomacy that we conduct or any other possible tool that we have available has to be exercised prior to that conflict beginning or prior to the crisis actually becoming a crisis. And it is in that context that I spelt out a number of possibilities or policy options that India could look at. Clearly, this is not an exhaustive list. The objective of the paper was, in fact, to start some thinking on what are the possibilities available to India in dealing with a situation before it becomes a crisis. And obviously, the decisions are taken by the government in the government, so I am not privy to them. But some of the options that I spelt out indicated that prior to the crisis, we could, in conjunction with other countries who shared our view, exercise a moderating or restraining influence on the two major powers involved. And those groups of countries included the Europeans, who have significant economic stakes in China, ASEAN, which has both economic stakes in China as well as, like us, stakes in the peace and security of the region, as well as a number of other countries a little further away from the region, but whose economies might also be impacted if there is a crisis in the Taiwan Straits. So, in a sense, what I was doing with the paper was laying out the implications or the potential implications of a crisis for India and for the region, and possible mitigation that can be undertaken by us prior to a crisis becoming a full-blown one.
Right, absolutely. That makes sense.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
I think one of the options that you highlight that India could undertake prior to a crisis is also that in conjunction with the United States, it could set up some logistical capabilities to respond to increasingly aggressive Chinese overtures. You mentioned that the US will have to put all of their logistical and basic arrangements in place before a potential conflict in conjunction with the conclusions of a CSIS paper that you cite. And then you kind of suggest that the US could indeed ask India for help and logistical assistance in such a context, possibly including the use of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. So, given that you mentioned that China has a two-front threat perception, and that you mentioned that, and not only do you mention in your paper, this is also something that the scholarly community has agreed upon, is that China has a problem with increasing proximity between India and the US. We even see that China's response at the Galwan Valley came after India's exercises with the US close to Tibet. So in such a context, wouldn't you say that these pre-conflict mitigating efforts may actually become the escalatory ladder that may eventually lead to a crisis, say, in the Taiwan Strait or even at India's border, something that India may have wanted to mitigate it, but instead ended up backfiring in its own backyard?
I have nowhere in the paper suggested that India should in any way take certain actions in conjunction with the United States. In fact, my paper says that India's position on the Taiwan Strait crisis has not been fully spelt out. And I also put forward what I consider to be likely demands or likely requests from the government of the United States towards India in the event of a crisis. How India will act in those circumstances is not something that I have actually stated in the paper. So I want to be clear that I am not suggesting, and nowhere in the paper does it suggest, that we should give logistics facilities or not to the United States government. That is entirely a policy matter within the purview of the government of India. What I am suggesting is that in the run up to the crisis, there are going to be expectations from the two major parties in that crisis. And I have spelled out in my paper what I think the Chinese expectations might be and what the expectations of the United States might be. And I have then left it to others to decide the manner in which we may wish to respond to these expectations and requests or demands, whichever word you wish to use. So, therefore, the objective of the paper was not to provide any guidance to anybody on how we may respond to those requests. It was merely an effort to flag that these requests might be forthcoming so that policy options can be prepared by the government and we are not blindsided when a crisis occurs and the request actually lands on the table of our government.
Right. So it's not essentially a suggestion, but this is scenario building. The US may eventually ask the Indian government for some assistance of this sort, and India will eventually have to be prepared, and the options can be assessed by the relevant stakeholders. Right. So coming back to the kind of economic challenges that may face India in a crisis situation or a conflict situation between China and Taiwan, we see that one of the most important disruptions that may take place from all the wargaming exercises and also from the conclusions of your paper is that trade in the South China Sea and across some of the critical choke points where a majority of India's trade does flow from will be disrupted. In such a context, is it possible for India, in conjunction with partners like the European Union or the ASEAN, to work on supply chain resilience measures that are essentially targeted towards a China or a Taiwan related contingency? Is it possible for these partnerships to have that in mind and then broadly identify what kind of trade disruptions may take place and formulate multilateral policies in response to that? Or are we seeing any such efforts taking place on the ground currently, considering countries in the ASEAN and in the European Union also now have their own ideas of threat perceptions to China, and countries like Lithuania are now increasingly severing their relationship with PRC in favor of Taipei. So can we see these few sets of countries kind of also looking at the trade and the economic aspect and working towards pre-conflict mitigation policies like supply chain resilience?
Well, that is a recommendation I have made in the paper. And we are seeing some follow-up in the sense that the countries of the Quad, Japan, Australia, India, and the United States are discussing supply chain resiliency and friendshoring of investments in order to ensure that if there is a crisis in the Taiwan Straits, the supply chains are not fundamentally disrupted. On the other hand, I think we should also understand that this is a long-term process. From the point of taking a decision to the point of implementing the decision could take a decade or more. And in that context, we might also have to work on contingency plans if a crisis occurs before you are able to diversify supply chains. So I think there are two sorts of contingencies we should be looking at. One is discussion on how to diversify supply chains to increase supply chain resiliency. And I think those conversations might already be beginning. But the more pressing contingency we should be preparing for is if a crisis occurs in the next 5 to 8 years, and if that reshoring or friendshoring or supply chain resiliency has not been adequately built up, then what are the mitigative measures that India might take or should be already having put into place before that crisis happens? So these are two different issues. One involving discussion with a number of neighbors, partners, and other countries in the region. But a second is a debate within the country of how you deal with the potential impact of a Taiwan Straits crisis on your economy, on your foreign and national security policy, and so on.
Right, absolutely. That's very fair. And of course, like you mentioned, this is a long-term process and some of it has already begun to shape on the ground. One of the factors that you also mention in your paper is that the chip shortage that would occur considering the massive impact any shutdown in the TSMC would have on the global electronic and automotive and computing worlds. And we've seen some of these negative impacts play out during the COVID-19 pandemic. And in this context, we're also seeing that the US-China rivalry over critical and emerging technologies like semiconductors, artificial intelligence, quantum, advanced computing is shaping up. So in that context as well, would you say that India may have some role to play, considering that India is not a very prominent actor in the very diverse semiconductor supply chain at the current juncture?
Well, at the current juncture, we are not a significant player in terms of manufacturing in the semiconductor space, but we still have some ability in the designing and in the software that goes into the semiconductors. And I think it is government policy now to quite consciously encourage the growth of the semiconductor industry in India, including chip manufacturing. And therefore, I think we have to prepare for both possibilities. One, the possibility that we can attract foreign direct investment into the hardware side of the semiconductor business. And second, also that we can attract talent to develop the software and the EDT tools and other such requirements of the semiconductor industry, and therefore become an alternative hub in case there is a disruption of the situation in the Taiwan Straits. So certainly it is something which will impact on us, and therefore we should be thinking about it. And I think the government's policy, if you look at it, is oriented towards that direction.
Right, absolutely. And with the opportunities that are opening up for, say, inviting FDI in hardware and manufacturing, with the adoption of China Plus One strategy and companies within China considering diversification of future investments, I think India may have much more powerful role to play in the industry in the years to come. And so I definitely agree with you on that. Mr. Gokhale, I have one final question for you, and this outrightly is a hypothetical one. You may or may not choose to speculate, but there is a lot of debate and contention around the timelines surrounding a potential Chinese use of force or a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, or China acting in an outright aggressive manner to reunify with the island of Taiwan. And some analysts put the deadline at 2024, citing examples from the third strait crisis and saying that this may be a way for China to influence elections taking place in Taiwan next year. And some put the timeline at 2027, which is the centennial of the People's Liberation Army. And some say it will be 2049, which is the centennial of the PRC. Would you have any thoughts on that? Would you say that use of force is even an option on the table among these contending timelines? And if so, when, or, if just to speculate, when or is this a possibility? If you would have any thoughts on that.
Well, force is obviously always an option on the table so far as the Chinese are concerned, because they have never renounced the use of force. But if force is exercised and when force is exercised is a matter which only the president of China can tell you about. The point is that I think we should not be talking of a crisis only in terms of use of force. And that is one of the key reasons I wrote this paper, because a large part of the strategic community tends to dismiss the possibility that China will ever use force, and therefore automatically tends to suggest that there will never be a crisis. The objective of the paper is precisely to separate the two. Irrespective of whether force is used or not, a crisis situation can still prevail through other mechanisms that China may deploy, which will disrupt shipping, trade, or semiconductor industry or supply chains in the Taiwan Straits. And that can be serious enough to have an impact on us and for the rest of the world. So I think it is a false question to ask when China will use force against Taiwan. I think the proper question to ask is, will either the actions of China or those of the United States, or both of them acting in concert, create a situation of general disruption in the Taiwan Straits? And is that situation likely to occur in this decade or in the next decade? And if that is the question being posed, I would certainly feel that there is every likelihood in this decade of such a situation emerging in the Taiwan Strait. And I want to be very clear about this. I am not suggesting that that situation will be a conflictual situation. I am simply suggesting it will be a situation where there will be a disruption in the general area of the Taiwan Straits, with the possibility of an impact going well beyond that particular area into the region as a whole. And because we are part of this region, it will have to a lesser degree an impact on us. To what extent it has an impact will depend on how that crisis pans out.
Right. That makes absolute sense. Thank you so much, Mr. Gokhale, for your insights and for your remarks in this podcast. I think both me and our listeners at All Things Policy will have a lot to learn and think about from this. I once again congratulate you on your paper, sir, and I hope we can host you again on this platform. Also, thank you to our listeners for tuning into another episode of All Things Policy. With that, we come to the end of the podcast. Thank you so much again, Mr. Gokhale.
Thank you. Thank you, Anushka.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.